The Green Bay Packers were now 3-5. However, they were about to turn it around. Before we get to this, though, I wanted to cover 4 more players. The first would be cornerback Jesse Whittington. In 1956, he was drafted by the Rams from Texas Western, where he played both QB and defensive back, thus demonstrating another case of someone being a quarterback in college, but having that aspect of his play ignored once he got into the pros. He was traded to the Bears in 1958, but they released him before the regular season began because he had developed pleurisy, which is an inflammation of the membranes around the lungs. That same year, he was sent to Green Bay. However, his performance for 1958 and 1959 were a bit underwhelming, as he would record 0 interceptions. However, in 1960, this is where things would turn around, as he would have 6 picks in just 12 games. In 1961, he get 5 more and would earn his first of 2 Pro Bowl appearances. Lombardi would praise Whittington for his speed, saying, "Speed offensively is great, but speed in your defensive backs is a must, and Jesse has that. He can run with any halfback receiver in the league, and he is a great student of opponents." And just how fast was Whittington? Well, what if I told you in the 40-yard dash, he reportedly ran slower than a 4.75? In a previous episode, I mentioned that Tim Brown and Hank Grimminger were the fastest on that 1959 squad. In the 40, Braun clocked in at 4.75 seconds in one practice, and Grimminger matched that time in the next. Contrast that to present times, where the average speed for a quarterback, depending on what site you pull it from, is now around 4.48 seconds. They were almost 0.3 of a second slower, and Whittington wasn't able to even match that. These speeds are often pulled from NFL combines, and understandably, they vary from year to year, but here is one example. So Lombardi was praising Whittington for his speed, where if he played today, it would be considered a bit of a liability. However, for the time period, he was quick, and he would be a big part of the Packers secondary of the early 60s, where he finished his career with 24 interceptions. This was in large part due to a leg injury. If he had played longer, maybe he might have been able to get back to form, who knows? But 24 interceptions in 112 total games averages to an interception about once every 4.6 games, which isn't the best figure, but from 1960 to 1963, the height of his career, his average jumps to 1 pick every 1.92 games. So if he played in a 17-game season, that would have given him almost 9 interceptions a year. Early in this documentary, I had already discussed running back Jimmy Taylor, but I wanted to expand on him a bit. Drafted by the Packers in 1958, he got off to a late start that year as Coach Scooter McLean kept him on the bench until the final 2 games of the season. However, Lombardi saw something in him and made him the starter for 1959. Unfortunately, the oil burn injury would cause him to miss multiple games. However, the following year would be the beginning of a legacy that would get him enshrined into the NFL Hall of Fame, with a high point being 1962, when he was named the league's MVP after rushing for 1,474 yards and 19 touchdowns. On the subject of Jimmy Taylor, Lombardi said, "Taylor may not be as big as some fullbacks, but he has balance and determination. He is hard to knock off his feet, and he fights for every yard." And Taylor was also great at protecting the ball. Packers historian Cliff Crystal said, "Taylor also had one of the lowest fumble rates in NFL history. He fumbled a mere 34 times in 2,166 touches, or once every 63.7 times he touched the ball." Teammate Paul Hornung said, "That son of a gun is the toughest son of a gun in the league. I've seen him run over guys 30 or 40 pounds bigger than he is like that. Jimmy Brown may be the best all-around athlete I've seen, but he doesn't have Taylor's desire." However, despite his great play, Lombardi evidently had some issues with him. Again, Cliff Crystal documents this. "I can't imagine that Lombardi didn't appreciate Taylor's hard-nosed play, but I've always wondered what exactly Lombardi meant when he wrote about Taylor in his book on football. He wrote, At Green Bay, we had excellent blocking backs in Paul Hornung and Jim Taylor. Paul may have been the best all-around back ever to play football, and his blocking was one of the reasons for that. Jim Taylor would have been the best if they had let him carry the ball while blocking, but he was still excellent. My interpretation was that Lombardi thought Taylor could have put more effort into his blocking and would have done so if he had been the beneficiary of it by gaining more yards. Instead, the other backs would have been the ones to benefit, and so Taylor gave less than his best effort. I get into the relationship between Lombardi and Taylor in our upcoming book, and so I asked Chuck Lane, who had a close relationship with Lombardi as his PR guy, what he thought. His sense was that Lombardi considered Taylor to be an I guy and not a team player. Taylor led the league in rushing only once, but despite any misgivings Lombardi might have had about him, he ran for 1,000 yards or more in 5 consecutive seasons from 1960 to 1964. He was the first NFL player to achieve this, surpassing Jim Brown's 4-year streak. In fact, when he retired, you could have argued he was the second best productive running back of all time. Now, let me qualify that statement. I am not saying Taylor was the second best ever. I am merely speaking about what people might have said right after Taylor's final season in 1967. We're not talking about what they would have said in 1975 or 1980. We're only talking about the context of that specific time period. So let's examine the evidence to back up this statement. First, let's look at the people who came before Taylor. Records in the NFL from 1920 to 1931 are not that reliable, but what we do know is that while there may have been some Hall of Fame runners, they were simply not putting up the numbers even remotely close to what people would later do. In fact, you have to go to 1934 to find a person who managed to rush for 1,000 yards. That was Betty Feathers of the Chicago Bears, and then that mark would not be broken again until 1947 when Steve Van Buren of the Philadelphia Eagles did it, and he would repeat that feat one more time in 1949. So now we're in the 1950s. Who were some of the great runners not named Jim Brown? Well, there's Hall of Famer Marion Motley, but he never had a single 1,000-yard season. Who else? Well, there's Joe Perry, who was perhaps more athletic than Taylor, but he only surpassed 1,000 yards twice. I'll get back to Joe Perry in a moment. Getting to the 1960s, Leroy Kelly had 3 straight 1,000-yard performances, but then he would never reach that figure again, and he'd retire with a career rushing average slightly lower than Taylor's. Gale Sayers came into the scene in 1965 and had moves that Taylor never had. However, injury would derail his career. More on him in a bit too. And for the purposes of this list, we are excluding any running backs who came into the league after 1967. So people like Walter Payton or Earl Campbell or Barry Sanders can't be on here. So where does that leave us? Well, the argument on who was the second best ever probably would have oscillated between Taylor and those other 2 backs I just mentioned, Joe Perry and Gale Sayers. While Perry once again only went over 1,000 yards twice, he did finish with a career average of 5 yards per carry, much higher than Taylor's average of 4.4. And Taylor had 9,723 yards rushing compared to Taylor's 8,597. However, Perry's numbers include 2 years in the All-American Football Conference before the 49ers joined the NFL. So if you don't include those 2 seasons, then Perry's career total drops to 8,378 yards, which is below Taylor. And with Gale Sayers, you had a player pulling off things that Taylor could never do, but again, he had injuries. Also, how you rank them is influenced by what attributes you're assigning the greatest importance to. Are we talking about pure athleticism? Then it's probably Gale Sayers. But remember, in this example, it's January of 1968, and we don't know how Sayers' career would unfold. While Sayers had a great first 2 seasons, he didn't rush for over 1,000 yards as a rookie. If you're talking about a combination of athleticism and work product, then you could argue it's Perry. If, however, you were talking about who was the most reliable runner to depend on when you need to grind it out, then it's Jimmy Taylor. He was a workhorse, like Perry never was. For example, Taylor had 7 straight seasons with over 200 carries. Perry never did that even once. You can be a better athlete and runner, but if you're actually not being given the ball to move the chains that much, then you can argue you're focusing on who looks better versus who is actually helping the team win the game. Better runners would come along after Taylor, but during his career, the only running back in NFL history that you could definitely say produced more on the ground than Taylor was Jim Brown. Joe Perry also tops Taylor, but again, if you exclude the 2 seasons before the 49ers were in the league, then he doesn't, and also Perry took longer to put up those numbers. I bring this up to emphasize how big of an impact Taylor made on his team, since it's one that can easily be forgotten today. He wasn't the most talented runner, he wasn't the most athletic, even for his time. However, players can be greater than the sum of their parts, and if you needed someone whom you could give the ball to over and over again and pick up first down after first down without the player getting too tired or injured, up to that point in the league's history, only Jim Brown was above him. Okay, moving on. Hall of Fame safety Emlyn Tunnell was one of the key pieces Lombardi brought from the New York Giants, not only for his playing ability, but also for his leadership. By the time he arrived on the team in 1959, he was certainly one of the older players in the league, but just how old is up for debate. For example, if you go to Pro Football Reference, he was born on March 29, 1925. However, his gravestone says it was actually March 29, 1924. Well, that's just a typo on the Pro Football Reference's website, right? No, it's not that simple. Even Lombardi himself wasn't sure about his actual age. Cliff Christl documents this. As for his age, he was listed at 36 in his final season in Green Bay, but Lombardi's refrain, whenever asked about it, was, "Only the Lord and Emlyn know how old he really is." And Tunnell himself was coy about his year of birth, but from what I've seen, it was somewhere in the early to mid-1920s, and more than likely before 1925. Getting back to his playing career, he started off in 1942 at the University of Toledo. In 1943, he enlisted in the U.S. Coast Guard, where 2 years later, he saved a crew member after his ship was attacked by the Japanese. After the war, he played at the University of Iowa, and it was in 1948 he would be picked up by the New York Giants, where he would achieve fame as one of the best defensive backs in the game. In fact, when he finally retired after the 1961 season, he had the NFL record for the most interceptions ever with 79. Cliff Christl again documents the words of Packers assistant coach Norm Hecker, who spoke of Tunnell's impact to the team. M could get a lot closer to the players than we could, Norm Hecker, Lombardi's secondary coach, said when Tunnell announced his retirement in March 1962. "I can't name a player in this business who has been so helpful to rookies, even though it may have cost him his job." Among the players that Tunnell mentored was free agent safety Willie Wood, who replaced him as a starter in 1961. Now, remember when I said Ray Nitschke was benched in 1958 due to poor play? Well, I found a little bit more information on supposedly why. Cliff Christl writes, "But when Nitschke blew several assignments in the 4th game, a 37-21 loss to Washington, a now healthy Bettis replaced him. Nitschke will have to learn to stay at home in his position," McLean explained. In other words, apparently Nitschke was running to where the ball was rather than following what position he needed to be in. Sometimes you can get away with this, but on a trick play or a play where a ball carrier changes direction, this can open up big gaps in the defense. And even though Nitschke himself said that he and linebacker Tom Bettis were friends, Nitschke's demeanor could at times be too much, and this once even led to a fight between the two. Christl writes, "The late Tom Waldorf, a beat cop who patrolled Green Bay's downtown streets in the 1960s, told me in 2011 that even Bettis once clocked Nitschke outside the Mayfair Lounge on Adams Street. There was a parking lot there," said Waldorf. "What happened was Nitschke wasn't a fighter. On the field he was, but off the field he was a little baby. He got in a lot of trouble. Bettis beat the out of him. It wasn't much of a fight. However, as mentioned before, Nitschke would modify his behavior and later mature. Now that's out of the way, let's get back to the newspaper accounts. November 23rd, 1959. The previous day, the Green Bay Packers finally put a halt to their 5-game losing streak by shutting out the Washington Redskins 21-0. So why were the Redskins so bad? Sports writer Lee Rimmel said the absence of Washington quarterback Eddie LeBaron was a big part of this, as he had bruised ribs. Redskins coach Mike Nixon said he might have been able to play LeBaron, but the condition of the field made that difficult. The Packers defense gave up 200 yards rushing, however only 69 yards through the air. Despite Washington being able to get the ball deep in Packers territory, Green Bay's defense was able to hold, and they forced 3 total turnovers for the game. The match started with the Redskins taking the opening kickoff. However, the Packers wouldn't have to wait long to get the ball, as just 3 plays into their opponent's first drive, Emily Tennell picked off a Redskins pass and took it 18 yards to the Washington 30. Jimmy Taylor went to the left to pick up 10 yards and get to the 20, but there was a mix-up and a handoff to Horning, and the Redskins recovered. Later in the match, McGee got off a bad punt that only went 19 yards, thus giving the Redskins a 1st and 10 at Green Bay's 37-yard line. The Skins earned 2 first downs through runs to get to the 14. Then they gave the ball to Bosler 4 times, including in a failed 4th down conversion, which gave the ball back to the Packers at their own 5-yard line. This began a 12-play, 95-yard touchdown drive by the Packers for the game's first score. Starr completed a 20-yarder to Dowler, and later McGee was hit for 11 to take it to the Redskins' 46. Then Horning ran to the right for 16, and Taylor picked up 7, also on the right. It was on this play that Redskins defender John Pollock swung at Knaffel, causing a personal foul to be called that brought the ball to the Washington 12-yard line. Horning then picked up 1. Another running attempt failed to gain anything. It was then on 3rd down that Starr found Knaffel for an 11-yard score. The Redskins tried to put some points up on the board, but Henry Jordan blocked the field goal and Hank Grimminger picked it up to take it all the way to midfield. From there, Taylor picked up 11 on the ground for a 1st down in the Washington 39. Horning followed by getting 3 of his own. Taylor continued to harass the Redskins' defense by gaining 15 more to get to the 21. Starr completed a short pass to Dowler that only picked up 3. After getting to the 10-yard line, Starr tried to throw a second TD pass to Knaffel, however, he wasn't able to hold on. The next pass, however, would not be dropped, as Max McGee held on from 10 yards out to expand the Pack lead just before halftime to 14-0. Green Bay would return the second half kickoff to their own 21, which would be the beginning of a 9-play, 79-yard scoring march. First, Horning ran around the right end for 17. Then Starr passed to Taylor for 7. Taylor would get the ball again, this time on a 5-yard run to get to midfield. Starr would then throw to McGee for 16, hit Dowler for 25, and a connection to Knaffel brought it to the Washington 5-yard line. Horning's number was called, and he rushed in for what turned out to be the game's final score, as Green Bay now led 21-0. Later in the game, the Redskins brought it all the way to Green Bay's 25-yard line. However, another failed 4th down conversion gave possession back to the Packers. However, Starr would throw an interception, and the Redskins would get it at midfield. Again, Washington was able to move the ball, taking it to the 10-yard line. However, Grimminger intercepted Ralph Guglielmi's pass in the end zone and managed to take it all the way to the Green Bay 43. From there, Starr was able to engineer a drive that looked like they might score again, but on the Redskin 33, Starr threw a pass to McGee that went too long, and it was instead intercepted by Gary Glick. McGee, now acting as a defender, raced to make the tackle, bringing down Glick at the Redskins' 1-yard line. It was noted that the interception may have been caused by Starr experiencing blurred vision. He had injured his eye in the game against the Colts, and apparently it was acting up again, so Lamar McCann was sent in, and on a 4th quarter drive, he was able to bring the Packers within field goal range. However, Horning's kick from 47 was short. And one of the players not being allowed into this game was the frustrated Ray Nitschke. In his book, Nitschke said, "It was the fourth quarter. We were ahead 21-0. There was no way the Redskins were going to beat us, and I kept expecting the nod, but it didn't come. Finally, with only a few minutes left, I went over to Bigston, who handled the defensive team. How about putting me in?" "No," Phil said. "We want the shutout." It wasn't a remark that did much for my morale. One of the players that would inspire Nitschke would be Jimmy Taylor. Taylor didn't get much playing time in 1958 either, but now in 1959, he was a key figure on the team, and Nitschke would use Taylor's work ethic and toughness as a blueprint to try to learn from and get more playing time. The final gun would sound, and the Packers would finally end their losing streak. Starr would finish with these numbers: 11 out of 19 for 120 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Jimmy Taylor would add these stats: 15 carries for 81 yards. And with receptions, Max McGee would do this: 5 catches for 75 yards and a touchdown. In the postgame, Lombardi praised Starr, but he was cautious about taking it too far. Barr has been getting better all the time, but I don't think anybody in this ball club has arrived yet. This is a real young ball club. Lombardi's attention was then turned toward the offensive line, with him saying, "That first line of ours is young. Virtually all of them are at most second-year men in the league. Ringo's the only one with experience." Someone then asked him how he thought this young team would do next year. "Certainly in the next couple years, we're going to be up there. I don't know where, but up there." Lombardi would bring up his thoughts on this game versus the previous week. "I think we played a better ball game against Baltimore last week and against the Bears the week before. We just made too many mistakes against them. We didn't make as many today." Bart Starr commented on the fine play of his offensive line. "I don't think any rush this season has been up to our protection. They just don't get there. It's been that way all year. You can count the times on your fingers that they've gotten in. They just don't. And don't you think that line of ours did a fine job in the runs? Jerry Kramer, for one, really played a heck of a ball game." Hank Grimminger, who, as mentioned earlier, had 1 interception in the game, said, "You get somebody to rush the passer, that's what it takes. We had a hell of a rush today. Made him throw the ball that way. In fact, that's the best rush we've had all season." November 24th. So the Packers are now 4-5, and due to the upcoming Thanksgiving Day game against the Detroit Lions, they had a chance to be back at 500 in less than a week. However, per tradition, this match would be in Detroit in Briggs Stadium. The Lions are a team that had fallen from grace, and after going to 4 NFL championship games and winning 3 of them in the space of 6 years, they followed up their 1957 season where they captured it all by going only 4-7-1. Efforts to regroup in 1959, however, were for naught, as they were going to enter this game with a 2-6-1 record. So since the Packers already beat the Lions before, it seemed like this would be an easy game. However, there are no givens in the NFL, and due to the shortened week, Monday would be a normal practice day, followed by Wally Cruz giving the Packers a scouting report. Oh, and in case you don't know who Cruz is, Packers historian Cliff Crystal sheds a little more light. He was a part-time scout for the Packers for 31 years under every head coach from Lambeau to Starr. He earned his living working for a commercial photography studio in Milwaukee and worked for the Packers as a side job. At a time when most teams had 1 full-time scout, he'd hired part-timers to handle different assignments. Getting back to that Monday practice, Boyd Dowler avoided near injury when he was going out for a pass, as he almost collided with a steel cylinder, which is used for the field's tarpaulin. However, he was able to jump over at the last second, as he had been a hurdler in college. It was noted that the cylinder was about 45 inches high, which is actually a little bit taller than the hurdles Dowler was accustomed to jumping over. And the paper noted the Lions game, which would start Thursday at 11 in the morning, would be a nationally televised broadcast with an audience of over 50 million expected. After the match, the Packers would be taking a chartered United Airlines flight, so in theory, they would be able to get home for their own Thanksgiving Day dinners. November 25th. The Lions, despite the record and despite having been beaten by the Packers earlier in the year, were picked as 2-point favorites in the game, which must have irritated the Packers a bit. Despite their last win, Lombardi would not say who his starting quarterback would be, instead stating that his decision would be reached on Thursday, the day of the game. In hindsight, the logical conclusion would be to stay with Starr. However, at the time, he just had his first real win as a starter, and McCann had led the team to a 3-0 record earlier that year. November 26. The draft for the 1960 NFL season was actually due to be held on Monday, November 30th, just 4 days from the date of this article. Why so early? Well, there are two answers to that. The simplest one is the rival American Football League, which would begin play next season, had already held their own draft on November 22nd and 23rd, so the NFL had to respond quickly to avoid the poaching of college prospects. The second answer lies in the fact that the league had actually already started the practice of an early draft starting back in 1956, reportedly to deal with the Canadian Football League. However, those drafts from 1956 to 1958 were divided up into two different parts. For example, in 1956, the first section took place on November 28th, while the last part was held on January 17th and 18th. For this year, however, the entire draft would be on one single date, and it would be held at the Warwick Hotel in Philadelphia. Lombardi would be traveling there to attend before rejoining his team on December 1st. And it was in the lead up to this where Jack Venisi announced his draft strategy. It's something new and not like anything before. The draft under Coach Lombardi is a complete 100% staff effort. We each make our own rating on each athlete, and from this rating we're able to figure the draft value of each prospect. It's almost like a vote, and no one man, as in the past, makes a complete decision on a prospect's value. The traditional mentality on the draft was that you made your pick based on what position you needed filled. You already had two good running backs and a third one is available. You pass on them and pick a player at a position where you have a gap, but not Lombardi. The Packers' end game was to have the most talent they could get, even if there was redundancy, because, as Lombardi has stated before, a new player, if necessary, could always be moved to a different position. And if you're curious who the paper thought would be the top potential draft picks, that would be LSU back Billy Cannon and SMU quarterback Don Meredith. Cannon would go on to play with the Houston Oilers, where he won a couple of AFL championships before going on to the Oakland Raiders and finally the Chiefs. And Don Meredith would get drafted by the Chicago Bears, only to be given to the Dallas Cowboys as part of a deal to be that team's first long-term franchise quarterback. At the time the article was written, it was predicted the 4 and 5 Packers would probably get the 5th or 6th draft pick on Monday. That's right. The draft was happening so early, they weren't relying on final regular season records, so if a team had a turnaround and managed to finish the season above 500, that wouldn't matter. They were going by what their records were at the time before the year ended. So despite finishing at 7 and 5, the Packers would get the 5th pick in the draft, where they would end up selecting halfback Tom Moore. That's all for now. When we continue, we'll cover the Thanksgiving Day match between the Packers and Lions. See you next time.